Hello and welcome. This is Callie from the Conflux YouTube channel.
And this is Josh from the Sapienite YouTube channel.
We both work together at Studio Pandemonia, and this is our first collaboration video. This video is about staple crops, which includes not only plants, but also animals. And we're working off the hypothesis that a lot of cultural traditions and taboos stem from what food source humans are investing the majority of their time into, and how that might affect their relationship to other cultures and what they're spending the majority of their time on.
We've decided to, like we often do, use the 12 signs of the Zodiac as an emetic to help memorize and organize these different categories.
For each of these staple crops, we're going to go over its associated zodiac sign, the foods included in that category, some examples of the culture which practice its cultivation, and its biological needs and suitable biome.
Different staples are adapted to different biomes in the world, and these differences produce different yields, different levels of nutrition, moisture, and so on. My background is in geography, and so I applied my mapping skills this time to a few maps showing the origin of these different crops. And we're also going to look into how these crops have traveled the world and spread to their current distribution in the modern era. It's interesting to see how some cultures adopt foods from other cultures, and you can see a profound change.
Meat is divided up into 4 different categories, the first of which is this game category. And before the advent of farming, this would have been hunted meats, such as wild boars and fowl and things. And in its modern context, on a farm, these would be things like domesticated pigs, chickens, and such. When we talk about a staple, as far as the food source that a culture is able to get the majority of its calories from, meat is particularly efficient for this because it is so calorie dense. And usually these cultures do also have to have some type of tuber, usually, or starch, and that's where we get the colloquial term meat and potatoes from, because meat is a great supplement when you have a primary food source that's very nutrient poor. Hunting is usually the focus of our narrative about our early evolution, especially towards the end of the Ice Age, when we were thought to be these great hunters of megafauna like the mammoths in the frozen wasteland.
It goes back much further into, obviously, sub-Saharan Africa, really to the invention of spears and group hunting techniques. Coming out of Africa, and many, many generations of hominid later, once we get to Homo sapiens, then it allowed them to survive in a lot of climates, like just beneath the glaciers of the Ice Age and the receding glacier lands, which would be essentially wastelands where only caribou and scarce resources are around. Going back to fire and cooking, getting more nutrients out of hunted game.
Right. Yeah, I just read a book about that called Catching Fire that talks about the impact calorically of being able to cook food and how important it was for meat in particular because of the additional safety considerations. Meat requires great care to be taken with cleanliness and preventing foodborne illness. It spoils very easily and has to be kept very carefully, so it has a lot of disadvantages over things that can be stored better. Poultry and pork have additional considerations, presence potentially of worms or of salmonella, and in farming these animals in close proximity to humans, there's also a risk of cross-species illness, and throughout history this has been a great concern with bacteria and all that, and how in order to get the full nutritional value for really like gristly or bony things or rendering fat, you have to potentially cook them for a really long time, right? Which required a lot of cooperation within a tribe to collect enough fuel to maintain fires like that. It was pretty much a full-time job.
They possibly began hunting megafauna like elephants and such at that point. But once they left out of Africa and started hunting megafauna on other continents, they began hunting them basically to extinction because they just didn't evolve to deal with that. Mammoths would be the big megafauna of Siberia and going into the Americas, including mastodons. In Europe, in addition to, I mentioned, caribou, which are still hunted in Sami lands today, horses were a huge staple of hunter-gatherers throughout Europe.
Well, it's quite taboo in some cultures to eat horses.
Well, it became taboo after much later, I guess, the Iron Age, the Indo-Europeans, when there became more of like a religious connotation, and horses were bred for riding and war rather than hunted. Because then a horse was a valuable commodity alive and not just dead and eaten. Some other places that meat makes a large percentage of their diet today would be the Inuit of Nunavut and northern Canada. They still hunt seal.
These cultures often have a strong desire to be in tune with nature and are very vigilant when it comes to the availability of water and quality of it, because those sort of watering holes are essential for attracting game and keeping them close to their territory. This can come into conflict with other ranching or herding type of activities because all of these animals are in competition for the same grazing sources and also for water.
So there's other significance to, sourcing animal products, such as, bones, which were used for decoration and carving and bead making and potentially for fire fuel, and leathers and things like that.
Bone, hide, sinew.
Yeah.
That's another one for bows.
Very important.
Fat for fire burning.
Yeah, candle and lantern and things.
So really, animals were like a huge part of an older revolution, hunter-gathering revolution.
Right, so this idea and this narrative that we have of, a lot of our becoming human and gaining brain mass and, growing to our stature and having all of these additional calories comes from this narrative of our big game hunting. But at least in my research, maybe in yours as well, it seems like this was actually kind of a later stage of hominid evolution, and that there was quite a lot of other food sources before that might have made up the overall brain size, growth, communication, and language development, and sophistication of tools before, the intensive organization of hunting parties and of endurance, right? Because we have faculties that other animals don't have as far as our hunting technique. We can really wear them down and, injure them
Long
and
distance.
then follow them. Yeah, whereas a lot of other hunters have to be ambush predators, or they have to, make very quick, decisive attacks. Humans can kind of camp out and do all these other things, and, because of our sweating ability and wearing clothes and all these other things, we can exist in lots of biomes. We have, I think, a lot of association of protein with brain mass, but there's new evidence to suggest that there were actually things like cattails that we would eat that provided a lot of that early growth, and that there's not as strong of a connection between language development and brain size as originally assumed either, which is really interesting looking at other things like Neanderthals. And
So what you're referring to is the gathering part of the hunter-gatherer equation, right? That's the other half that doesn't get enough press.
Meat is this kind of primary Aries category, and Aries is commonly associated with like the beginning and the first, and it's sort of got this
Primeval.
Primeval, exactly. Primitive,
Primordial.
Yeah. And yet
Fire energy.
that might not necessarily be our point of origin, but it certainly has like a strong narrative. So carrying that forward,
Hunting.
yeah, how do we go from hunting to, I guess,
Factory farming.
there's steps in between.
Maybe
How do we
that.
begin domestication? Right, because we couldn't domesticate mammoths. There's certain categories, antelopes can't really domesticate, so we started to selectively breed and take some of the more docile forms of things, right? The contemporary era, we have things like pigs and chickens that we raise for meat, other, poultry and things like that, turkeys,
Fowl?
fowl.
Yeah. How old does that go back, I wonder?
Well, we know that
Or like dodo birds,
we know that one of the
They're pretty
very
easy.
earliest, and one that actually remains a significant source of meat today, but maybe we don't know so much about here in America, is pigeons.
Yes.
Pigeon farming is one of the earliest, because they can go all the way from being fully domesticated, message carrying, super spies, or they can be just very, very lightly domesticated by simply building them a roost and kind of harvesting them as they come in. So that goes back very far in the Middle East and Egypt.
There were definitely like pigeon covens, or what they're called, or pigeon holes. They would build these entire structures, and that would be around modern Turkey, Syria, Iraq, so Mesopotamia, more in the highlands and the mountains, the Taurus Mountains and the Zagros Mountains.
Chickens in particular, and you find in island places, you find in Polynesia, a great love of both pigs and chickens and cultivation of those kind of all throughout Southeast Asia as well.
And pigs and chickens in Polynesia then came from the Neolithic in China, right? So they were like traded and settled all the way out to as far as Easter Island from originally Taiwan, and originally from that more around the southern China, I guess the East Asian Neolithic, which is kind of a separate epicenter from the West Asian Neolithic of like grain in Mesopotamia and the Levant and such.
As far as I know, in Europe, most of the fowl were more things like quails and game hens and smaller things like that. I'm not sure when chickens came onto the scene there, but a lot of the hunting that was still going on in Europe, of course, there were European bison that were hunted to extinction, and gladly they're bringing those back now, but deer and just more wild game like that.
It's interesting that that eventually the caribou hunters, I mentioned the Sami of northern Finland, currently domesticate and at some point domesticated reindeer, and they milk them and herd them, really.
Yeah, there's a little bit of crossover there between this and our shepherding category. So to bring this into the modern day, these horrific factory farms. So, meat is of particular interest and scrutiny right now because of our unsustainable farming practices and the huge amount of resource, in particular that cultivation of meat in this intensive farming way and the waste that it produces, and the incredible increase in demand, especially in Asia, is really cause for concern. So, of course, culturally, this presents a pretty big conflict between these other vegetable-based cultures that we'll explore going forward, and this as kind of the primal meat category, although we do have other meat categories. In talking specifically about the domestication of cattle, Josh, can you go back and rewind to the origin of these primordial cows, which were a somewhat separate issue from the rest of the hunting, right? There were oryx that were hunted and they were treated somewhat similar, but cows were pretty quick to domesticate, as I understand it, compared to these other wild meats that we were pursuing.
So the cow that we usually refer to as like a Western Eurasian cow is actually native to the Taurus Mountains, which is why fittingly cattle is related to the Taurus sign in our categorization here. And that is southern Turkey and near Syria. I believe they were mostly domesticated for meat at first. And also they helped in labor. They'd be pack animals. I think farming was coexistent with domestication of cows. Right. And so they were probably used very early on to help field work.
With the plowing and the and water buffalo.
Yeah, and the very first wheels and the very first chariots were drawn by cattle. And
not horses, huh?
And not horses. The wheel was invented in the Middle East, and that would be the original kind of caveman, Flintstone, solid wheel looking thing, just a big solid stone. Now, there are other cattle species in South Asia and East Asia, respectively. They are water buffalo. The South Asian variant, I think, probably was from somewhere near the Indus River and was probably therefore used and domesticated by the Indus Valley civilization. Whereas the East Asian buffalo, domesticated probably somewhere in Southeast Asia, near Vietnam, and quickly migrated north into China. So they were also domesticated around the same time, probably for meat uses.
So in addition to providing meat and labor, cows are also prolific at producing milk and, providing a basis for a dairy-based diet. And often, as we see in India, the milk is actually a substitute for eating the meat, and they maintain a vegetarian lifestyle with this high protein source. What can you tell me about the impact of milk on culture?
Originally, during the time of the Indus Valley Civilization, beef was actually a majority of the diet. They didn't seem to have that taboo at that time, which again kind of relates to the Indo-European example I brought up with the horses. It's like when they were hunted, there wasn't a taboo against, eating them. When it started to become taboo to eat horses is the same time that horses had another use. And so perhaps when water buffalo and then western cows traded to the Indus Valley were being milked, then there was a cultural shift. That, maybe not just that, but that in combination with many other things seem to have led to a more vegetarian diet there. If you have milk and it's a viable substitute, then you become more vegetarian. In the diet, the rest of their diet is substituted by all kinds of grains and nuts and other supplements. Some of the necessities for ranching cows would be you need large grazing lands. Fairly large if you're going to get big cows, and if those cows are going to produce milk for you. Again, I'm not sure how soon milk lactose intolerance went away and they adapted to that.
My understanding is that a huge step in overcoming that was the production of cheese and some of these other products.
That's
are
right.
Actually easier to digest and provide better preservation, and also, high dense calories. So it may be that, just drinking raw milk might have been a little bit later.
It was mostly an accident. Like, fermentation is an accident. You leave something in a pot, you don't quite clean it just right, and you find out later, someone takes a bite and they're like, this is actually kind of good. That's another, byproduct of the Neolithic Revolution, of just that people were trying out all kinds of things. They started using pottery and all other kinds of containers to contain things like that and to ferment things. Fermentation for beers and really everything.
It's really fascinating how regionally dependent the types of cheese that they could produce are because of the types of, yeast and bacteria and things that they have available. All of their different climatic factors as far as humidity and the heat. Some places you get really hard cheeses like Parmesan, and other places, like India, you have really soft cheese products like paneer that are not cured, don't have these long aging times. Of course, there's a lot of sustainability concerns with grazing of cattle and how destructive they can be when confined to kind of close quarters and overgrazing. Same with any grazing animals, but they're also very generative, right? If they're allowed to rotate appropriately, then they're depositing a lot of manure. And I actually saw a documentary about the evolution of plants that was talking about how, grass evolving to have silica to protect against grazing animals actually contributed to the depositing of sand in the ocean, because there were just so many grazing animals eating up all these tiny little chunks of silica.
That it was just going out into the rivers and then in the ocean.
Right. So prairies, grasslands in general, are some of the most productive biomes on Earth as far as carbon sequestration and diversity of life and all of that. But it seems like this large demand of land use comes into conflict quite often with other ways of life. Other intensive farming of things like corn, which require huge spans of land for a limited amount of the
moisture.
Year. Right, competition for water for sure. Because we hear historically about cattle being this commodity and kind of the impetus for many egregious transactions and raids.
Cattle raids.
Yes. Yeah. How do you think just the sheer demand of this type of lifestyle kind of invites competition and potential hostility?
It seems to me, looking at the Neolithic Revolution, that there's a very simplified idea of it. I don't necessarily hold to completely, which is, sedentary life, that sort of civilization. This idea that civilization or being civilized means settling down and having a permanent place and completely just eating grains and bread and nothing else. And it's not quite in my mind what the Neolithic was actually about. I think the late Neolithic and going into really the Bronze Age and Iron Age, when you start getting large nation states and empires, then at that point they do start to monocrop a lot. But from my perspective, I see the Neolithic as a permaculture movement. And so the transition to grains and farming crops, I think, was a slow process of adopting the next big thing after the next big thing. And halfway from hunting and gathering to farming is grazing, ranching, and shepherding. Culturally, you have a shift. The previous staple of game meat, successfully hunting, is like the most valued thing. There's not an idea that like you can steal someone else's prey. Like you could, but most tribes would just move to different lands and try to balance their tribe with the carrying capacity of the land they go to. And that's why humans spread across the entire globe. It's because we were constantly chasing the next natural grazing point. It's a natural evolution from that we would, as human beings, try to control this more and to make the prey stay within what land we want, to ranch our prey. And that starts to bring land ownership in. The less carrying capacity land would have, and the less available new outside land there would be, the more competition there would be between different people and different lands and different herds. And at that point, essentially the cattle and the herds become property, or they're perceived as property. And if another tribe or another group is hunting your prey, then they're taking your property. Then you're getting cattle raids. Really the beginnings of war. They're beginnings of crime, in a sense. If resources are scarce and you don't have any, now it's an option to steal them from the neighbor. The reason why you would want to strap a cart to a bull and walk it across the land is because you want to get somewhere probably far away without having to exert too much energy, and whilst also carrying a lot of your property with you. And so this caravan idea starts to develop. And in the Neolithic, obviously it was a Neolithic expansion. It wasn't just a revolution, it was an expansion. People with these technologies and these techniques and these cultural practices literally spread throughout much of the world and spread their way of life and themselves through travel. Cattle cultures tended to evolve directly into grain and farming cultures. They became more sedentary, more fenced in, although travel, as we mentioned, was a very important aspect of what cattle culture provided. Ultimately, it was movement of property from one land to another, and that quickly developed into many collective cities. In those cultures, the danger of property theft became something of a catalyst for building walls higher, or building up walls and having more of a centralized, organized structure of government. When it comes to shepherd cultures, they seem to have retained a more nomadic and semi-sedentary lifestyle, where they would move from grazing land to grazing land. It was usually smaller groups. Tribes continued to exist in, say, the Bedouin culture for a long time, and that would be goats, sheep, yaks in the Himalayas, llamas in the Andes. Like cows, they were often used for milk, at least at some point, and also meat, but they were usually less valuable as pack animals. Llamas is an exception there. Camels would also be considered somewhat under the shepherding category, although camels to the Bedouins essentially replaced cattle as transportation, as a pack animal, which made them extremely kind of specialized, especially since a camel can survive in the desert for so long. It makes it easier for them to move from place to place and herd. There's also this cultural motif in shepherd culture of defending against the wolves. It's in many myths. A shepherd is primarily a protector of their sheep. So it's mostly them versus the nature. And that's because a lot of the lands that they grazed off of were fairly scarcely populated, and their carrying capacity is not very high. A lot of the places that ended up being civilized, so to speak, and farmed were lowlands and wetlands, river valleys. And although shepherdry used to be very well done in those places, the population boom from doing so in those places led inevitably to civilization and large social structures in those places. And also, when the city structures began getting powerful, they would start exerting control over everyone in a certain region. Shepherds, if they're not within that system and they're not part of that system, kind of had to leave those areas and go to the more exotic places, like the Bedouin Desert, for instance, or the Sahara. And using something like a camel, they could really benefit from doing that. They could survive where no one else could. In the case of goats, the highlands were like a very vital place for them. It was very easy to rear goats in the highland, and the highlands aren't very conducive to a lot of agriculture as well.
So another big part of shepherd cultures is there's this other benefit, right? We have the meat and milk, which were very crucial, but also fiber. So this whole tradition of fiber weaving and craftsmanship and the synergy between the fiber produced by the animals who were thriving in these highland regions and perhaps colder climates, and their ability to outfit the humans with the wool necessary to survive in those colder reaches that became very like one another in a way.
There was a period, of course, where all of these cultures were simultaneously experimenting and living amongst one another. And that was, of course, the early Neolithic. So shepherds, farmers, cattle ranchers, everybody, hunters and gatherers were all living in semi-sedentary situations, like say in the Levant of the Middle East. There was even a practice of, in the winters, they would settle in the valleys and farm, and then in the summers they would go out and graze and shepherd with the animals. So a lot of cities were settled by people in times of hardship when the herds were going away and going extinct because of climate change. They would kind of be left with their winter home, and that winter home would become more permanent. The farming and the animals that they had there became their main staple, and they could no longer venture out into what was then a desert and graze anymore. Because for the longest time, like Arabian desert, for instance, was green, just like the Green Sahara was green. And at those times, huge numbers of people could just be shepherds and just get by herding animals, and there would be plenty of land to graze. Weaving culture developed at that time when people were doing all of that at once, and the house became a thing, and machines started becoming a thing, technologies that would help develop and produce more complex goods. As some of those resources became more scarce in the fertile valleys, the shepherd cultures actually became extremely valuable. It's part of the reason they weren't wiped out entirely is because they had a huge economic incentive there to produce a lot of these goods for the cities even, and to also trade between cities. And that's where, again, the idea of a caravan and trade really begins, is these people who they can just go between cities and trade things, and they have their own trade, and it's mobile, and they can take it with them and their own stock and everything. And they're able to make a good living even though they're living off of very minimalist lifestyle. So like as far as where weaving goes into that, I think a lot of them would have to have become pretty specialized weavers.
So would you say if the wheel was the hallmark of the cattle culture technology, would you say the loom was then kind of the high technology of shepherding culture?
In a sense, that almost seems to be the case.
So this traveling nomadic lifestyle necessitates, advanced language and communication and history keeping and things like that. But in South America, we have a very advanced fiber culture. The Incas with alpacas and llamas, and their knot tying tradition, which is used to keep track of dates and important information, and in geography that's not really conducive to caravanning in the same way.
Mountains.
It had to be traversed by foot, and it was through, related to weaving type fiber techniques that they actually kept information. Can you tell me a bit about the relationship between this Geminian messenger archetype and storytelling and weaving traditions, and how those things all relate?
In the case of the Incans and their writing system, I think it relates also to many of the oldest writing systems, even like cuneiform in Sumer. No, most certainly the most common writing purpose was economic. You would write down, 5 chickens, 1 cow traded today at Uruk. Like, how do we begin to get the skills to actually write down epic poems and stories? It began through commerce, which is also why Mercury is not only a messenger god of wisdom and knowledge, but also of commerce. And that's where Merc in his name comes from.
Oh, okay. I would think it'd be more like mercenary and that whole...
Mercenary. I think mercenary actually has a similar root, because a mercenary is like a private outside person who's not part of the civilization. There were many shepherd groups at a long time ago that were actually... They became war tribes in a lot of cases. They were hired by people.
Does that come back to your earlier point about the necessity of the shepherd to fend off the wolves and protect his flock?
I think there's a propensity in shepherd culture to develop a, how you might say, libertarian viewpoint. And I think the fact that they tend to excel in environments that are relatively more scarcely populated, there is less resources to go around. You have to be a lot more stingy about who you're giving them away to. There was also a period of time where the Aramaeans, they were considered like shepherd mercenaries, literally wreaked havoc across Mesopotamia and the Levant and the Phoenicians.
Terribly antisocial.
They messed with the Assyrians so bad, and the Assyrians were so angry about these particular people and what they did, that they had a chip on their shoulder for the next several centuries, and they just conquered and invaded and massacred everybody they met. They were just total assholes. So yeah, a shepherd culture can do that to you.
So we've talked about the main meat categories, and now in transitioning into the vegetarian side of things, here is the plant that is most like meat. And for that we need a switch of scenery.
Yeah, let's go to the other side of the world. Let's go to East Asia.
So Josh, can you tell me about the origins of soy?
So the origins of soybeans cultivation in China is actually a little obscure, and we don't know everything about it entirely. From my research, it seems to have been ubiquitous from the start. It seems to have originated and been first farmed around, I guess, north central China, south of Beijing, around the Yellow River. And it might have originated more upstream or downstream, but the Yellow River is always changing directions, and it's like it completely can shift from one sea to another. It creates a lot of flood-prone areas, which soy is in need of a good amount of moisture. Every floodplain and every river has its own personality.
Is there
an entire plain.
Is there something in particular it's depositing, or?
Yeah, the Yellow River is yellow because it has a lot of silt, very fine silt, yellow-colored silt that comes from its headwaters, which are in the Gobi Desert. When silt goes downstream, a lot of it stops along the way. Eventually, it might stop so much that it can stuff up and dam up its own river downstream, which leads it to start flooding off into other directions and change directions. And there's so many ancient stories in China of the Chinese emperors at any given time having to face the crisis and succeed in these massive, absolutely massive engineering projects in order to redirect the Yellow River how it should be. But yeah, there are all kinds of catastrophic floods from the Yellow River throughout Chinese history, flooding entire cities.
And so soy is into that?
Soy seems to be in need of a lot of nutrients, so that would be silt, right? Lots of silt, because silt has the nutrients. But also the water is... It's almost like a sprinkler. Like the river is a sprinkler. So this giant swath of land is extremely fertile.
Soy has some remarkable benefits as far as when cultivating it. It is a legume, so it is nitrogen fixing. So it's not as intensive of nitrogen-based fertilizer like something like a grain. And it has a lot of nutritional benefit as it has a very high protein content and is a suitable substitute for meat-based products. And it's interesting that soy is ubiquitously Chinese, despite having other places within Asia where it can potentially be cultivated. In speaking with various Indian people about this, about why soy isn't more utilized in India, where, there's similar vegetarian lifestyles, that the answer was just like, we just don't have that. It's not really grown here. It's not something that's been developed. And it's interesting that in China and Japan in particular, the fermentation of soy and its various, advanced forms like soy sauces, very artisanal and have been developed to a high form, the same that cheese has been, throughout the world. So it
tofu
very much,
and everything. Yeah,
it very much takes that role.
It's extremely important in those regions. And today, of course, soy is extremely popular throughout the globe. Very popular with the young.
Normalized, but also strangely stigmatized. I wonder how much of that
There's a lot of stigma.
Is geographical or racial, because
I think it probably does stem from some of that
there's
colonial.
a lot of propaganda that is not necessarily nutritionally or environmentally based.
It's kind of weird. It's weird for such a good, valuable crop to be so late discovered, because you would expect a good crop to find its way across the world if there are trade channels, and there were definite trade channels between China, between much of East Asia, and going all the way to the Roman Empire and such for a long time, that you would think something would be traded. I mean, we know that sweet potato found its way from the Andes to the Polynesians, that the Polynesians at some point landed in South America before any other old world power and traded for this and propagated it throughout Polynesia all the way into New Zealand and all the way into, I think, Indonesia as well.
Right.
And so then you it was good. Like, potatoes are so good that they took over the world, the old world, when the new world was discovered, right?
You would expect something this nutritionally valuable because, soy versus potatoes is just not even a competition as far as what it can actually do for your body.
A lot of people don't even know potatoes are not from...
Yep.
Say goodbye to a lot of things that are on our list.
Yes. It is strange that we don't see more of that kind of cultivation elsewhere in the world. And
we do now more.
A little bit, yeah. Now the West has kind of adopted more of those vegetarian alternatives, tofu, tempeh, seitan, all of those kind of things.
It's a whole subculture now.
Right.
It's like a millennial, it's right there next to avocado toast.
There are also not soy breakfasts that I've really found, or desserts. It's very strange. Like soy, you would think, because of its very mild neutral flavor, would lend itself to sweetening, especially like looking at soy milk. Often that's used for lattes and sweet things. Like, why don't you see Asian desserts that are made of soy? And Chinese people I've talked to, they're just like, I don't know why you would want that. Like, what do you mean? Why? And it's like we have all these sophisticated like fried tofu things, like very unique textures and all these things. And you have a lot of Asian breakfasts and desserts that are based on beans, legume beans, right? You have red bean paste, very common sweetener. On the whole, I would say that, East Asian palates are maybe not so sugar intensive as like our Western palate. No. Their desserts are much more muted. And so there's actually a lot that's based on bean paste, which to us would be kind of bizarre. Like why would you have beans for dessert? That sounds a little bit weird.
When it comes to America making soy milk, we do a thing that Asians wouldn't do, which is we pour tons of sugar into sweetening the soy milk. Like, if you ever had unsweetened soy milk, it is very bitter, it is very boring, it is gross. So in America, we have to sweeten it with a totally separate crop based on sugarcane and based on other sugars.
And they prefer
the West
more
is very
unrefined.
addicted to sugar, for sure.
The sugars that they seem to prefer are more like brown or black sugar, which are closer to like molasses. They're much less refined than the white sugar that we usually get from cane and from beets. Actually, a huge portion of our
American sugar is actually made from beets.
Yeah, it's sugar beets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's right. I was
That's
thinking.
our-
I knew
that's-
there was another one.
Here in Michigan, that's actually our main export crop. I didn't know that.
Jeez.
Have you ever seen a sugar beet?
They're in the ground.
No, but at the store.
No,
You can't buy them. I have looked.
why can't you?
I don't know. It's the
Just
same
'cause
as the
they just
soy
mass
question.
produce
Like
it.
there's something very strange
Maybe it's
about
very
the
unhealthy
raw
to
form.
eat a raw. I mean,
Not
especially
as far
now.
as I know.
So, bridging into the next category, amaranths, millets.
Basically seeds.
To bridge soy into that, actually, proso is a type of millet that was cultivated in the upper Yellow River, so more near the Gobi Desert area, but still on the river, still in the wetlands. Even still is a drier area that the river valleys were the place where people started to gather. And the particular group or culture that gathered here became eventually the Han Chinese. So the Han Chinese, which is today the majority of Chinese culture, is actually native to the upper Yellow River near the Gobi Desert. And this would have been one of their first crops that they were cultivating, was a millet. It was a proso. I was researching, and actually they have good evidence that it was first used primarily as animal feed for pigs and possibly chickens. I think chickens might have been native to southern China. Some of the oldest writing and cave paintings, they had glyphs on caves, and there were a bunch of cave cities. Another really old civilization from a culture separate from the Han in Manchuria is the Manchus, and the Manchus are actually a Siberian culture. So the Manchurians on the Liao River had a staple crop of millet as well. Another kind of millet or amaranth or seed-based food were in southern India, probably started by the Dravidians or even earlier than that. Sorghum by Nilotic, Nubian, and Chadic peoples in the Sahel region of Africa. There are also amaranths in Central America.
That's one drawback of them is that they do require preparation. They do need to be cooked. And the main simple form of that is porridge. But once they are prepared, it's extremely nutritious and efficient food, as you would expect from seeds, which have all the components needed to start a new life of a plant. Quite prolific crops that are pretty efficient on space. They do require a good amount of watering, and thus they seem to be around rivers and wetlands. But as far as their yield, it's quite good per plant.
It's part of why they probably started using it just as food fodder for animals, is because it was just so plentiful. And if they were primarily at that point basically more like a cattle culture or a shepherd culture, then it would have been very valuable as that. But as they began to settle, they would have started to make porridges and spice it up a bit.
Right. Well, one thing that was interesting in my research was that it's particularly energizing, incorporating that into the diet of soldiers. They were getting consistent, good results in armies that, they say an army marches on its stomach.
That reminds me of sunflower seeds. I think during World War II, American soldiers characteristically had packs of sunflower seeds that they would chew on all the time. They have the yield of grain, and so culturally could have a similar population boom. There's so much that it provides a lot for the development of a more organized, centralized civilization. But on the other hand, since it has so many more nutrients than grain, it also kind of provides plenty.
Well, it is
and it's easy.
It is very seasonal. It's very sunlight intensive, and I don't know that you get multiple yields per year.
An interesting takeaway also culturally is it seems to me that a lot of these regions with these millets tend to have a good amount of spice in their food. Southern India, Sudan, Ethiopia. We've got Central America, so we got peppers and stuff from that region in Central America of Maya and Guatemala. As you, I think, mentioned, it requires so much processing. It can't just be eaten raw.
Porridge is not necessarily delicious.
Doesn't taste very good.
It needs a little something. It's somewhat more wild than some of these other things. It's something that you could just go find in a field and notice. They're very brightly colored. They're quite flamboyant usually. They are very tiny. And so when it comes to the gathering method,
You know, you have to have a very fine
pretty meticulous,
mesh. Yeah.
Intensive.
Yeah.
So which
Attention to
again makes it
detail.
kind of similar to grain, because you got to get such small little grains
Yes.
in order to be
Yes, you have to collect
producing
a large
anything.
quantity to get.
And you have to process it, because of course grain, people don't just chew on grain. Porridge itself is not actually as good as just making bread itself. Bread itself, through its kind of process of enlarging and it creates a sugar
Right.
when it
Well,
burns on
there's
this.
also
It actually
other,
has more flavor to it when
millet
it
can be
burns.
processed into other things too, though. It doesn't just have to be porridge. It can be made into noodles. And
Yeah.
I've been looking at this recently as a gluten alternative, fine
Interesting.
alternative carbs. And yeah, it's with more processing, it can be made into a myriad of things and retain quite a lot of nutrient.
A culture that has that resource, in a way, they have like a super weapon. That's true of grains. That's true of millets. It's like they could be processed into so many different things.
Well, I would say, you know, certain grains perform higher than others in that. Oats, I would say, are very close to something like soy with their versatility, right? Because soy can be anything from milk to meat. Like, it's huge. It's a huge range for a single plant, you know, and oats can take on kind of similar... it can be structural or it can be liquid, you know, and that kind of versatility is kind of hard to beat. So in that way, millet is much more specific and limited in that way. But, yeah, the energy output is quite high.
In a way, it's like an art. It provides a medium that allows a culture to express itself in so many more ways.
Well, and also just the seed category in general is interesting because some species can be pressed and actually made into oil, you know. And oil expands your cooking abilities into all of these other areas, right? You can have crispy food, you can have, you know, all of these textures,
put it on your meats.
all of these things. Yeah.
You can do all kinds
of stuff. So it's adding a cooking method and also building in nutritional value as you're doing the preparation. So in that way, you know, seeds are, a secret weapon. They're incredibly powerful.
Let's get the other grass out of the way while we're at it, which would be corn, right?
Yes,
maize. A New World crop, most likely from Mesoamerica, near Yucatan or the Veracruz coast, and maybe even could have been the Mexico Valley up in the mountains. It's not entirely certain. There's some people who say it could have been from the Mississippi Valley, but that's not a very popular hypothesis, I don't think. Maize was first fully cultivated in Mesoamerica, and then it spread down through the Andes to the rest of South America, and up through basically Texas and the Southwest and the Mississippi River. So that would be the ancestral Caddoan people, Dakota Sioux, and all the other Sioux people, and also Iroquois, Cherokee.
And it's interesting to note that all of them took great care with corn not to monocrop it and had sustainable farming practices such as Three Sisters, which involve coupling corn with other... Three Sisters is squash as a ground cover, beans as a legume, and then corn as the monocot, and it provides the structure for the beans to grow up. So in this way, you don't have as much nutrient depletion, but corn just on its own as a grass is very nitrogen depleting, and therefore it's very dependent on constant inputs of fertilizer. So,
because grasses, again, they're developed through grazing animals over time. Like even before we actively herded animals for graze, animals were naturally grazing on these grasses.
But the way we grow corn, you can't just march the cows through. It's very destructive. So
no, it's not really compatible anymore.
Well, one thing we can be certain is that the form that we see it in today is very different from its ancestral form. It's been selectively bred to the current state with the giant honking kernels. It was much simpler grass.
Most people who would probably look at it in its original form would think that it was grain, that it was wheat or barley almost, because it was just a long grass piece with a head of a few little corns on it. Another kind of reference that I think I have to make because it's just so popular is corn is often referenced in like the Bible and in like archaic contexts in the old world. But corn simply means the head of a grass. So the head that has the seeds in it. Whether it's the amaranth, sorghum, or the grain, or the maize, which is the yellow kernel. that is all like corn, essentially, which is also another reason why we should probably use the word maize, because it'd be more applicable. In some like contemporary Judeo-Christian renderings of certain scenes from, say, Joseph and the Pharaoh, they literally have ears of like maize from the New World, and the implication is that the Egyptians were farming corn back in the Bronze Age. No.
Maize has a lot of pros and a lot of cons. It's a lot. It has, in the form that we've bred it to these days, has pretty good yield. You know, we get quite a lot out of it, and it's able to be made into many different things. The expense is that it's very nutrient intensive, requires a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer, a ton of sunlight, and just massive tracts of land. So it is a very sacrificial thing to spec into corn. In Mesoamerica, and particularly the Aztec culture, the development of really innovative farming techniques like the chinampas.
The perfection of mud.
That would have been an incredible melting pot for both optimizing the farming technique and being able to crossbreed and try lots of different things.
Corn's pretty big too. We really think of like a whole ear of corn. It's a massive staple.
Yeah,
really.
It's much more human scale. It's much more handheld and kind of accessible, so that might be why it was able to become such a standard. But
each person gets a whole set of popcorn, essentially.
Right, popcorn. But originally, it was used much more like other grains, and it was ground into flour and made into tortillas.
Corn flour.
You can make polenta, cornbread, corn cakes, and things like that. Yeah, so in its flour form, it's very different than in its feed form, which, a lot of the problem with contemporary corn, besides the monocropping, the pesticides, the GMOs, and everything to do with that is, the extensive use of corn for animal feed, and animals don't digest it super great, so it makes them sick.
Very
and they make us sick,
gastrointestinal.
and it's just all bad. Yeah, so overproducing corn to feed animals is not a very adaptive strategy. And it's interesting you mentioned earlier, the proso being originally used for animal feed, is a much different situation, something that they're more able to digest, but yeah, corn presents a lot of problems when we've taken over and subsidized it and used it for all these other things like ethanol and corn syrup, and are just trying to shove it anywhere we can.
Kind of crazy, actually.
Yeah.
To use it as a fuel, it's like, let's not go there.
Efficient,
let's really not go there.
Let's super not.
We produced enough of both oil and corn. Let's not make more.
But as a food in its older form, right? If you look at indigenous corn, it's very colorful. It's not all just yellow. It comes in all kinds of varieties. It's usually much smaller and nutritious.
The corn's also very sweet. I don't think you mentioned that it's one of the sweetest, most sugary of all the crops that I think are in the list. Isn't it?
I think that's true. I mean, potatoes are starchy, but it's not quite
of everything in our list, I think it's the most likely to have someone think it's a fruit. It's like, oh, it's a fruit because it's sweet and I like it.
Barely a vegetable nutritionally, though. Just not the same.
Oh, we do have some tropical stuff in the later list.
Yeah, but
those are definitely sweeter.
But your point stands as far as as far as sugariness. Contemporary corn has definitely taken on that role, because maize is so sun dependent and requires just these huge clear tracts of land in particular, just very open and very flat. I think it kind of invites a sort of solar centricity in the culture, and maybe like it's also very volatile of a crop. It's very vulnerable to plagues, to locusts and just any bug. Bugs absolutely adore corn because it's sugary and sweet. Of course they would love it. Yeah, it's difficult to store. It invites rodents, so it has all of those kind of issues. And I think it's a very feast or famine kind of thing. You're making this huge investment over the course of this whole season, but it can be ruined by a single hailstorm. So it's a bit more of a gamble than other crops. Some other crops are more resilient to something like inclement weather or not quite enough water. But so it is a great sacrifice, and you really have to dedicate yourself. So I wonder how that theme of sacrifice maybe plays into the cultures that we see it so prominently in.
this need to organize and, centralize, this heliocentric, we see some evidence of that in the architecture. We see, these storage structures, along with being solar-centric, right? We have investment of the entire culture in mounds, in things to keep track of the seasons, in, astronomical sites. It implies investment in something of a scientific or priestly class that would be tasked with keeping track and protecting this precious baby corn that needs so much tender care and needs to be protected from.
And this is a trend that is quite common to grasses in general that we'll get into in the next category, centralization, and a tendency to monocrop.
So I've been kind of harping on this sun thing and this astrological thing, because there seems to be quite a lot of emphasis on like passage of time and stars and things, and especially like Mayan culture. Do you think that there's something about cultivation of grasses in particular that puts a culture in kind of that celestial space, the stars and the weather pattern?
Calendars.
Is there something kind of like sky oriented compared to other, perhaps cow worshipping cultures that are a little more down to earth?
Where are these places? These places are usually in flat plains, often in floodplains. When you have a flat land, you gain an intimate connection to the stars in the sky. You can see everything, and it's most of what you see. And when storms come by, they are like mountains, and it's part of how my passion for like storm chasing came about, for instance. But when you're in a place where grass tends to grow, it tends to be a flat place where you see the sky very often. But on top of that, many of the valleys, like the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile and the Indus and the Yellow, all of these river valleys have cycles, and they have seasonality to them. They have times when sowing and growth and harvest. When you have that kind of tradition where you know the best times to be wherever you need to be to get the best kind of food, at least the three places we could mention: the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, China with the Yellow River, with the soy and the amaranths we were talking about, and then in Mesoamerica with maize. We see three of the most important Neolithic expansion. We didn't talk about rice yet. That's actually the most important one in China, but there was like a separate one in China here with the Han and their own proso. When you look at all three of those cases, you have cultures that have some of the oldest calendars in the world. And it makes sense. They need to keep track of them in order to keep track of their seasonal cycle. I mean, I would venture to guess that a lot of these particular grasses are very temperamental to season. We haven't talked about rice yet, but we know it can be cultivated multiple times a year. When it comes to herding, mostly you're always chasing the herd, or you're always trying to find new pastures. You can't just get off the season one year and let all your animals die. You have to be on it 24/7. So for them, like, life is herding, and there's nothing else in life. For farmers, life changes in their cycle. So yeah, I would say that calendars and astrology in general are very synonymous with grass-based food cultures.
So we've talked a lot about the effect of various staple crops on different types of living arrangements and different states of permanence of settlements and cities. So now that we come to the category of grains and cereals, this one has perhaps the most profound impact on permanent types of settlements in large cities out of all of them.
So grains, mostly rye, wheat, and barley, have had a profound effect on much of Western civilization, and then beyond that into the rest of the world. It could be easily stored, and then it could be stored at multiple stages in its process. So you could just store the grains themselves. You could grind them into flour and store that, and then you could make it into bread and eventually pastas and things like today, and store that as well, and basically mix it in at any stage with water and other foods in order to get a good amount of calories. Preservation is probably the most valuable thing that grains have given to the table. It's similar with a lot of the other grasses, like millets that we talked about, and it's not so much the case for corn. It is somewhat harder to keep corn. You can dry out corn, but it isn't quite as nutritious or as succulent.
And different, the seed-based things and things like millet don't store quite as well as wheat because they're high fat content, and anything with that kind of oil goes rancid. Although, of course, wheat has additional storage considerations in that pests like to get in at different, like, insects and moths and things. Not as much on rodents as some of the other things in their whole form, but
grains don't require as much moisture as some of the other crops on our list. Certainly not corn.
or rice.
Certainly not rice coming up. It needs to be grown with a fair amount of water, which is part of why irrigation was so common in Mesopotamia and the Middle East. But these regions are fairly dry.
Yeah, wheat's unique because it grows in colder climates, and also it has an entire winter season. So you get 2 main rotations out of it, which is what helps the high yield.
So having a crop like this that could grow in such numbers, in such quantities, throughout such a dry and arid region for so long, really helped boost the carrying capacity of certain areas.
So initially, right, this took the form of what we called unleavened bread, right, without the assistance of yeast or rising agent, and they were very simple, cooked breads, pan-cooked breads. But
accidental.
As we got to fermentation, right, we introduced different types of yeasts and got different rising qualities on them, and we got various fermented beverages from the rye and barley as well as wheat. How does this kind of go with our theme of Libra as far as being a little more strict with weights and measures?
When grains were first being developed and experimented with in the Neolithic, it was by the Natufian culture of the Levant, and that would be around the Jordan River and around the upper Euphrates in Syria. At first, there's a seasonal rotation, so in the winter you go down to the valleys and you harvest the grains and have semi-sedentary housing and storage as well. And then in the summer, they would go out to the savannas to hunt. And so there was still a balance of hunter-gatherer and a little bit of farming on the gathering side for half the year. And so these settlements started getting more and more permanent when the climate of Arabia, the Arabian desert in particular, started to change and the savannas started to go away, and a lot of the hunting animals started to go extinct or migrate elsewhere. And we talked about how the shepherding cultures then diverged from this Natufian farmer culture, which tended to settle down more. We see in the important city of Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey around Syria up in the Euphrates River, we have some of the first evidence of granaries storing multiple varieties of grains.
And now the significance of granaries in particular is trying to pest-proof the storage, right? There needs to be, it can't just be something in an open basket or anything that can absorb moisture, right? We have to start investing in bricks and clay and
large castles. Essentially they're creating large palaces to accumulate all these resources and try to keep them away from animals. We also have records in Göbekli Tepe of an astrological, even Zodiac-based sort of calendar system. There were different animals associated with different constellations, some of them resembling the constellations of the Western Zodiac today. Many of them also different, but fairly clear evidence that there's some level of centralization, organization, construction, organizing yourself around the seasons and around the farming. And then you started to see some of those structures moving south into Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world. That was actually part of the Natufian civilization. And then northward into Anatolia. And from there, basically spread the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic, throughout much of the world. All the way into Indus Valley, and then all the way over into as far as Spain at the time.
We talked a little bit about theft in the terms of the cattle type of cultures where there was raiding and theft in that way. Kind of in a slightly different mood is this idea of fairness when it comes to paying your dues to this larger organized mechanism of the city, which is housing and protecting the crops. Maybe not so much of like a military protection at first, but more of just preventing against catastrophic loss of agricultural value. The period where the Neolithic really started expanding everywhere. So many places were desertifying. The carrying capacity of many savannas and plains were lowering and going away. People started coming together and trying to problem solve, trying to figure out ways to preserve more of resources in this scarcity. For a good long while, it was like a golden age where you would have plenty because they had practices coming together almost like contemporary permaculture where it was all working together in unison. Scarcity
was crunching people together into cities in such a way that they would have to start organizing and rationing their food.
Those conditions kind of came together in a perfect storm of bad conditions when you consider the types of pests that the new granaries were attracting and encouraging, and how now having a high population living in close proximity, being exposed to plague-carrying rats and such.
Yeah. There's new evidence showing that one particular civilization, the Kukeni-Trypillian civilization or culture, I call them the Calcuteni because they were in the Chalcolithic, which is the Copper Age, which is the transition between the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. So it's near the end of the Neolithic. This Calcuteni civilization near modern Ukraine, with huge, massive cities of very dense population, had the first pneumonic plague. And this plague, researchers are finding, may have led to near extinction of Neolithic people outside of the Middle East in Europe. And that might have led to the Indo-European people coming from the steppe and migrating in, not purely just as conquerors, but just as like coming into a place that had been ravaged by plague, and they had something of a immunity to it that they developed with close proximity to the source, since they were trading with the Calcuteni for a while. And so that's an example where there's a new innovation. Hey, we got to live together, we got to work together, let's put all our granaries all together in one place. And a lot of these places don't have too much evidence of hierarchy yet, like the Indus Valley civilization as well. We don't have clear evidence of a hierarchy of kings, of a monarchy or anything. And so it was kind of like everyone come together and let's share. It's very egalitarian, very almost utopian. But they came to see that there was some contradictions in the system that just couldn't work out. And it came down to plague, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just had no way to combat it.
No, they didn't. Fast forwarding a lot later, when we start to actually have hierarchies and we start to have cities that are building hegemonies, conquering other cities, and eventually the great Sargon of the Akkadian Empire founding the first empire in the Middle East, we see even more centralization that could be between multiple cities. And we start to see monarchs and kings taking over the priesthood and asserting their own hierarchy, their own class and caste systems. This would be in Indus as well, when the Brahmins start kind of taking over the system and the hierarchy, and it leads to the caste system of India that largely and still exists today. We see that system throughout a lot of the Bronze Age and then into the Iron Age. Well, there's a definite link between the Libran motif of fairness and balance and harmony and the priestesses of Ishtar throughout Mesopotamia, even before the Babylonians. These priestesses were slowly losing power, losing grip over their particular city population, and over, metaphorically, making sure everybody gets a piece of the pie, making sure everybody gets their bread.
Right. Originally, it's not some sort of strict caste system, but more an attempt to divide labor equitably.
No, it seems that, or the earlier we go back, we see that a lot of the cities in Mesopotamia are run by female priestess class. And even the kings are subservient to those priestesses in a way, almost like justices. Mm-hmm. Like literally the symbology of Libra. And as we go deeper into the imperialization of these cities and civilizations, we find that they start to be replaced by kings, hierarchies that are not so egalitarian.
Right, and we start to see this military expansion during the Iron Age. And
yes, iron as a resource versus bronze, very briefly, is more common. Bronze has to be made from copper and tin. These are found in very different places on the earth. And so people had to have extensive trade in the Bronze Age. The militaries were a bit more coordinated and centralized. When iron started being smelted, it democratized weaponry. And in the same way that guns democratized war and gave everybody, from the lowest peasant to the greatest king, an equal standing, iron was that revolution. And it led to many different migrating war tribes coming in to wreck the Bronze Age civilizations. And we see that as the Bronze Age collapse, and like the sea people And so that was the clear and certain death of the original kind of Neolithic dream of like, let's all come together and have plenty. It eventually just evolved into every man for himself. And it's interesting because that's actually, if you read Hesiod, that is what he argues in his ages of history. From Golden Age to Silver Age to Heroic Age, then Bronze Age and Iron Age. And he refers to these ages as like successively worse and worse and worse until in the Iron Age everyone's fending for themselves and everyone's at war. And
so basically wheat contributed greatly to this decline by providing this food security and starting to build up like these larger cities who kind of got to the fringes of what they were able to
they maxed out their carrying capacity. And
then they were easy to usurp and take advantage of, and the food security from their established agriculture made military expansion particularly easy, because we talked a little about that in the Millet section about the army marching on its stomach, and the portability of bread in particular has a lot of advantage over some of the other staple crops when it comes to launching military campaigns. Of course, it wasn't in quite as palatable of a form. It was more like a hardtack kind of thing, but they were able to maintain, rations that were much more portable, and I think that probably contributed as well to.
Yeah, the apex of that would be the Roman Empire, for sure. Their organization on that was very good. The Persians had their own system as well. A lot of empires had new innovations to try to make sure that their armies were running and well fed wherever they went. And it's very different from, say, a Mongolian model, which is more of an old-fashioned, almost migration model where they were always hunting. And they were essentially a mobile tribe that had a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They're hunting and they're gathering. Now, many armies throughout history have always been hunting and gathering alongside their campaign. And that's interesting. That plays back into the Aries identification with the game hunting. But when it comes to this newfound power of bread, it's a democratized, preserved, centralized form of food. There's one species of grain that exists in the Americas that was actually cultivated by some of the southwestern cultures like the Pueblo and later the Navajo and the Hopi and all these other southwestern New Mexico, Arizona sort of zones. And that was rice grass. It's not a rice. It's definitely a type of grass.
Have you ever eaten it?
I have never had it. So another interesting crop in the Americas to transition into the next staple is wild rice. So wild rice was cultivated by Ojibwe, larger Algonquin, Sioux, and has been cultivated for a very long time, especially in the upper Mississippi, so around Minnesota, Wisconsin. And it's close to my heart because I'm from Minnesota and we have the best wild rice. Or at least I have my favorites.
My mom
wild
likes
rice
it too,
soup.
so it must be. No, well, the thing about wild rice is that it actually performs best being wild, and they have a hyper-specialized way of gathering it, right? So for those unfamiliar, wild rice is it grows along the riverbank, and so it's completely maintenance-free. You don't actually have to do anything or cultivate it. It spreads pretty wide as long as there's a body of water, and you don't have to do any special irrigation. And then what they would do is they would just take a canoe and have a couple beating sticks.
Yes.
I don't know what they're called, but you just whack it over the side of the canoe and give it a couple pounds and it falls
Get a bunch
in.
Of seeds.
And you just scoop it. So it's like one of the most low maintenance compared to its Asian counterpart, which is extremely labor intensive and has to be every single little seedling has to be put quite intense.
So wild rice is very distantly related to East Asian rice and probably resembles what rice might have been like when it was most wild a long time ago before cultivation. In China, entire infrastructures and landscapes have been scraped away to make way for rice paddies and terraces and such.
So the trademark of all rice is that it is probably the most water-intensive thing. It's way up there. Tropical things are too, but rice needs to be completely submerged, which is really unique among all of these crops. It's quite unusual because usually being waterlogged is actually going to rot out the roots of most other plants. But rice can thrive in environments that are completely aquatic. So that is, both a blessing and a curse because it can only be grown in places with high moisture.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to like make a field of rice, you would have to landscape the terrain.
Yeah, terraform.
You're basically terraforming. But a culture like China that has adapted to doing that for thousands of years gets to the point where it really does have a profound effect on their culture. We talked earlier about the Yellow River and its effect on the state and the necessity of the state and the government and the emperor to step in to redirect the entire river so that it doesn't destroy entire towns. It was a necessity that they had to do terraforming, essentially, that they had to do mega projects. And so things like the Great Wall are just second nature. It's like, well, we know how to build.
Mm-hmm.
And then in southern China, around the Yangtze River, is where rice was cultivated.
And so there's two main strains of rice from what I could tell. There's kind of the more short grain varieties that are more around China in origin, and then there's an Indian variety that's more what we know as basmati rice, that's a little longer grain, that's more towards India.
There might have been some original wild rice somewhere in between there in Southeast Asia, that these were two separate, I guess, speciations of that original.
Ancestor. Sure.
Mm-hmm. There's also an African rice in the Niger River, I believe the upper Niger River.
Mm-hmm. So it's not exclusively Chinese, but China took it to a whole other level with cultivation. And they did, like we talked about before, also use water buffalo for use in the manual labor and terraforming projects themselves, and then also in the tilling and establishing those rice paddies. So we talked about the influence of grain on having a more centralized and collective type of city building civilization. And rice has a lot of similar advantages in that it can be very easily stored. It has a little bit less on the processing end than wheat in that it doesn't have to be milled. It can be prepared fairly quickly.
The collectivism of grain culture versus the collectivism of rice culture, because I think both have a certain collectivism.
They both have some, but like what made the collectivism of rice culture much less susceptible to the individualistic way, and like you said, the democratization that eventually overtook those grain cultures. Of course we do, it's not that we don't see some sort of hierarchy or imperial vein in China, obviously, but there does seem to be more of a retained collectivism as far as the ethos around cultivating rice. Why do you think that is?
I think the attitude when you're in a flood-prone region like the Yellow River or in a very wet region like the Yangtze, I think the government and the state very specifically has more of an obligation to the people. I think government comes about because of its usefulness in organizing people. With grain, the granaries had to be collected and distributed to the people and defended, but that opens also the possibility of hierarchical.
Okay. So would you say that maybe it's a difference between the need for constant maintenance when it comes to the granaries versus the one-time investment of major engineering projects?
Well, there's another difference between the two, is rice has so many different growing seasons within 1 year. Especially in southern China where it's cultivated, they can have up to 10 or 12 different yields. Yeah, insane numbers of yields. Grain, on the other hand, as you mentioned, 2 at maximum.
Which is still more than like corn or other things.
Yeah, which are 1 year of putting a lot of effort in and getting one full yield. When you have a year-round farming regimen and it's not as seasonal, then it's not even about government at that point. To some extent, the government's more involved with grain because of that seasonality. Like the granaries have to be filled up at a certain time and everything has to be distributed at a certain time. But in China, there's more room for decentralization of rice cultivation. Like every major farming area, every major town has its own rhythm, and they're 24/7 always on it, always maintaining, always producing more and then having surpluses that they send to the bigger cities and such. So like it's just almost as it's like the difference between a system that's running half the year versus a system that's running like 24/7. You know, something gets more efficient and more effective and more focused. They can provide a large population that doesn't have to be directly within primary production, because that's another key thing. It's like that we didn't quite mention, I don't think, about all the grasses we've been through, including corn, is you don't need to devote all of your population to farming. You just devote certain members of the population to farming, and then you're able to have other populations specialize in other things. Right. That's really just what the Neolithic and agriculture in general does, is you don't have to be hunting and gathering all the time for subsistence. You can do other things.
Set it and forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so compared to wheat, for all the flack we've given it, rice has poorer nutritional value, at least modern rices. Wild rice is pretty nutritious, but white rice is mostly filler.
Well, we talked about how millets lack a good amount of taste, right? And so they needed to spice it up a bit in order to make it palatable, and they had to process it a little bit more to make it palatable. Although rice doesn't need that much processing, it's like pretty good right away. Rice is a good base in a meal. Mm-hmm. So you have a rice as a base, you can put all kinds of things into it. You can use fish, you can get the soy and then turn it into soy sauce and put that in it. You can put all kinds of spices from Southeast Asia at the time.
Or putting curry over it in India's.
Yep.
So with rice going particularly well with fish and vegetables and certain other things, you know, maybe it's more conducive to incorporating minerals and nutrition than, you know, if you're just eating a bologna sandwich, you know.
It's like a good blank canvas. And you can make all sorts of beautiful pieces of art on it. The more blank it is, the more freedom you have to do whatever you want with it, you know.
There's a lot of accountability within, you know, the whole of the watershed, really, to preserving the quality of water and, you know, putting the needs of the many over the needs of the few as far as things like contamination, or, you know, there's a lot of accountability when it comes to any enterprise that might be contaminating or degrading the quality of the water. Yeah, I think there's a social consciousness in these cultures, particularly about water, that's really in line with the scorpionic values.
It takes a lot of discipline to grow rice.
Oh yeah, well, it's not going to, it's, in the case of, you know, these cultivated rices, it's not going to grow itself like a wild rice, so you do have to put a huge amount of back-breaking labor into it, and just having the rainy season versus the dry season in places that we see rice cultivated is its own kind of challenge, and having to deal with typhoons. And
there's another staple crop that we haven't really gotten into, and that is tubers, potatoes, for instance.
We mentioned it briefly under the meat category because it so commonly is paired with hunting culture, or needs to be supplemented by meat because of its nutritional deficiency, but seems to have a particular synergy with meat as an additive.
It also needs a lot of other spices and things, like tomatoes are native to where it came from as well. What do you have with your fries? You have ketchup that goes all the way back to the Andes and where the potato is from, cultivated most famously by the Incan Empire, but many, many other cultures. Sweet potato was also traded to the Polynesians and went all the way into Indonesia on its own volition because of just how useful it was for these traveling people who needed some starchy, high-calorie foods on their voyages.
Yeah, now potato is a very feast or famine staple. It's quite risky, you know, because you're not able to observe the progress. You have to take a lot on faith. These things are developing underground where you can't see them. I've actually grown potatoes before, so I can ascribe to the heartbreaking nature of this hobby. You know, you put all your hopes and dreams into this crop underground, and you come up with these tiny little things by the end of an entire growing season, and it's quite sad and disappointing.
You're birthing little gremlins.
So the needs of potatoes, they're pretty moderate when it comes to watering needs. They don't necessarily need to be like irrigated per se, but they do need adequate rainfall, and they need to have sandy soil is better especially to be able to harvest them peacefully, because you have to actually, it is a lot of manual labor for actually digging them up and cleaning them up and stuff. When it's good, it's good. When you have a bumper crop, you can really get some serious yields from any of the tubers. And they store very well. They're very stable. They do have to be kept in a cool, dark place.
You can also process them into all kinds of powders and things. Like a lot of the other grains and things, they can kind of be molded into various various uses, for sure.
Yes, boil and mash and stick them in a stew, as they say. They are versatile. They go with pretty much everything, and so that's why you see them all over the world. You know, they're pretty durable in shipment as well, which is particularly important in some place like the Andes, where they have to be hand transported and schlepped around and banged around, so they have pretty tough skins and kind of offer their own protection a little bit compared to some of these other, you know, grains and things that at a certain point of processing become very fragile.
Potatoes were such an important crop for the Inca and the Andean civilizations, just because building up in such high latitudes and not having access to like steady running water, like how would you pump all that? You know, it's not easy. So potatoes grew in all kinds of climates and all kinds of places up there where it's cooler, and it could be in the ground, which is safer from any freezes or anything. So
also safer from pests. You don't have to worry about hail.
Yeah,
or
or animals coming in digging it up.
I mean, the animals do dig it up somewhat, but like it's a lot more effort, and so it affords some natural protection.
High mountain cities like Machu Picchu are just insane. Being able to support those populations in those places, especially when you don't have horses and all you have is pack animal llamas, which does help, but mostly you have people running around with carriages by hand. You're not going to want to have to transport food very far. Now, potatoes, I think, is such a mobile food and such an easy food to just plant wherever you can. I think the Chaki are called, Chasqui, would run relay messages throughout the Incan Empire. They really needed some calories to be able to do that. The people who evolved to live there, you really had to adapt to living in those climates. To this day, a lot of Peruvian people have very different perks in their physiology and their lungs, and in order to adapt to such low oxygen, high elevation environments. So they really found something, probably an early root that they cultivated over a long time as they themselves were adapted to the mountains to grow in the mountains, because they knew that they couldn't do this maize-based agriculture in this region. They had to try something else.
Also, they're starchy and delicious. They require, just pretty rudimentary preparation. They're already pretty much ready to go, which is great. And something like sweet potatoes and yams are particularly nutritious, much more so than like regular white potatoes. But they have different minerals and nutrients than some of these other categories, of course, because they're based in the ground. So.
And another kind of tuber that's extremely important, especially in Africa today, is also native to South America, and that is the cassava. That was native to Brazil. Today, and ever since, they've been traded to Africa, and Africans have made them their own.
There's typically kind of a division of gender roles where, the males do the hunting, and meat is very appreciated and prized, and they like it very much. It's very valuable. And then typically the women do this gathering of tubers like cassava, and they're kind of heavy and labor intensive, but that provides the baseline of calories. So if for some reason the hunt is unsuccessful, it's not the end of the world. They still have plenty of food, but of course they'd really prefer if there was meat on the table. And they find this in other places as well, in Australia, Aboriginal tribes, and even island tribes. There's usually some form, maybe it's not one of these refined forms of tubers like potatoes, but there's usually some kind of root that they will get at. You can also eat like the roots of like lotuses. I know they have taro also in China. I don't know that it would be considered a staple in China, but they have some dishes based on taro that are quite good.
Because you can just kind of leave your potatoes in the ground and go away and do whatever you want until harvest.
You're very free.
You're very free to move and travel, gather elsewhere and hunt elsewhere. it would be a perfect bridge between hunter-gathering and farming. It would be something where you never really had to adopt a full agricultural sedentary lifestyle. You could just...
Well, no, because you'd be working off your stores from the previous year while you're gathering the new ones, because they're so readily preserved, they can keep all year if it's in the right conditions. So
it's like a sustainable practice for hunter-gatherers, essentially.
It'd be quite perpetual, especially if you've got multiple species. And there's all kinds of potatoes that, there's red and purple and yellow and all kinds of different ones that have been bred.
Again, there's all these kinds of new world crops that have been taken over by the rest of the world into the modern era. I mean, we talk about the potato famines of Ireland. It's like, wow, how did Ireland get so into potatoes? Well, to bring the example of the kinds of places you can grow potatoes, Ireland is fairly cold. There are a lot of highlands there. It doesn't have the best soil for planting almost anything else. And so they had a single species of potato that they were cultivating from the Americas. And the reason that the famine happened was because, again, a monocrop and a monospecies crop, it's just one variant. So if there's one disease, it might kill off the entire variant.
Other variations, though, that are also significant are things like poi in Polynesia. They have very sophisticated irrigation from the mountain to try to preserve the flow of water all the way down as it goes into the ocean and create these pools. Similar kind of infrastructure to rice. It's mashed up and served in a similar way and is very significant to them. You can dig up roots of all sorts of things all around the world. But it's interesting to note that roots of other types of plants are commonly used as medicinal ingredients. So there's something kind of more on the medicinal side of things, perhaps, when considering roots in general. We have things like ginseng that are prized as very valuable medicine.
Isn't ginger a root as well?
Yeah, ginger. Is turmeric also a root?
Turmeric is a root, yeah.
Yeah, things like that.
And
Wasabi.
Yeah, they're a bit more, it's weird to say garlicky, but they're like a bit more like
But garlic
herbal.
is a bulb, yeah. It has a certain aromatic quality.
Yeah, and like onions and garlics, those are a separate vegetable. Definitely not a staple crop.
No.
But they kind
Maybe for me, but
they're kind of in that herby group though, because their nutrients are so high and rich that you could basically overdose if you have too much. That's also true for some nuts like pistachios. I know I've had the unshelled pistachios, and that was not a good idea. Like, you need that extra time for your body to process them when you're opening the shell, because they're so rich in the minerals that they have.
It's definitely easy to overdo it on starch because you can become lethargic. They're not offering a ton of nutritional value as far as protein. So if they're not being supplemented by a protein, then it can be kind of problematic.
Yeah, for potatoes and me, I have a very bad relationship with potatoes. They almost always make me extremely lethargic and give me headaches and stuff.
But they're finding increasing evidence that potatoes were actually more significant to our early development and expansion of our craniums and brain capacity than perhaps meat itself. Tubers, just the tuber category, cattails and tubers and starches, that a lot of our brain mass actually might have come from. And tools are particularly important, of course, for gathering the tubers themselves. It's important to have very hardy, like hoes, pickaxes, things to actually agitate the ground, because you can't really just dig up potatoes with your bare hands.
You don't need to flatten and wreck and...
Yeah, you don't necessarily need a flat space, no. No, potatoes are pretty forgiving.
It's easy to plant, hard to harvest.
Yeah, for contemporary farming, one of my favorite methods is the bag method, where you actually have like a mesh or a canvas bag, and you can just put dirt in it and grow them in there, and then it becomes very easy to just kind of shuck the entire dirt mass and wash it off, and then the potatoes are all that's left. It's way easier than having to actually excavate and get them out of the ground, so growing them above ground is also an option. Yeah, it's also interesting that potatoes are pretty forgiving when it comes to harvesting. If you're off by a week or two, it's not really the end of the world. You don't have to pick them at the peak of freshness. Like, there's optimal times, but they're going to be insulated and protected. It's not like they're going to rot off the vine like other things. But now moving from tubers to pulses,
which is beans.
Yes.
And then that impacts, of course, much of Mexican cuisine and Tex-Mex cuisine today as well.
Yeah, but interesting that you can have an entire dish based just on beans. They really do stand on their own, which I think is quite unique. So they do form a pretty good basis. We haven't really talked about, back in grains, we didn't really talk about how those cultures didn't tend to necessarily be vegetarian despite being vegetable based or non-meat. Things like the cereals and rice, and they kind of can lend themselves to being vegetarian, but it's a little bit more difficult because of their nutritional deficiency. Whereas here in this category of pulses, which also includes lentils and chickpeas, you can kind of get more protein out of this category, and so there is more potential for a fully
the beans themselves have a lot of protein, which is similar to soy. Very similar to this particular.
Vegetarianism in China and the Buddhist traditions kind of has to be supplemented with soy. I don't know if you'd really get by just on rice.
It bears repeating that when it comes to the grain cultures, they were being supplemented by a variety of meats. And these are shepherd meats primarily. So cattle and shepherd meats. So there was beef and there's lamb or mutton and goat. And then almost every culture has a subsidy of fish, which we haven't gotten to yet. But
it's interesting, that beans nutritionally have a lot going for them and can kind of stand on their own, but they're also very easy to add to other things.
And it just so happens to be that a lot of the places that beans were grown had all kinds of delicious spices that we also love today, like chilies and various kinds of peppers.
Yeah, so looking at that vegetarian ethos, looking at pulses in India, we talked about millet and rice, but there's also a lot of dishes that are heavily dependent on lentils as a staple, and of course chickpeas in the Middle East. Grinding these things into various pastes and using them as kind of a basis. It's very different, to have kind of a mushy paste-based dish compared to, a bread-based dish that's maybe like a sandwich or something. It's kind of interesting how each of these bases kind of behaves. You talked about a blank slate of rice and things like that.
Beans kind of are a topping, right? Yeah. So, like, if you look at Middle Eastern recipes, we see, like you mentioned, that the chickpeas and pita breads. Then you have something of a smothering of the beans on the bread, and then that's like even in peanut butter on bread, there's something of a motif going on there.
Yeah, because as a paste, it can be a topping, or it can be like a dip, or because they do kind of have their own coatings. Beans that are put as a topping on things kind of maintain their shape while still being really palatable and mouthfeel, pretty comparable to rice as far as softness. One interesting innovation of veganism is aquafaba, which is the water of beans. If you take like the juice out of the can that beans come out of, you can make like an egg substitute, like an egg white substitute. It's very strange. It behaves pretty similar to eggs because of how protein rich it is. And so fun fact. Yeah, so being able to get more protein that way and not need to supplement as hard, if you combine that with like cattle culture and dairy and milk, then you can have pretty intensive vegetarian lifestyle there in India.
There's so many different varieties of beans and green beans and peas and everything. They didn't have, apart from llamas, much of a shepherd culture, because llamas was mostly in the Andes. So if we talk about Mesoamerica and the Aztec and the Mayans, they didn't have shepherd meats. So they really didn't have a consistent meat source. It would be more like hunting, but it's much more dangerous to hunt in practically a tropical rainforest in a jungle than in
more competition than on a plane.
Plenty other places. So it makes it quite difficult to really do that. So having beans is something of a lifesaver.
Yeah, beans are also unique for a few different reasons, just in the way that they grow. There's a lot of beans that are climbing or trailing, and so they, have to be grown up a trellis or like a supporting vertical beam, but like they're taking up kind of a different type of space. And we talked about the Three Sisters farming earlier as far as beans being able to grow up corn stalks, and you're doing more individual family farming, beans can be really great. And they're also being legumes. They're nitrogen fixing, so they're not like a grass that's just depleting the soil
No, they're not
rapidly.
depleting. They're adding good enriching minerals to the soil.
So you don't have to rotate as much, and you can kind of grow them in similar places.
It's also part of the reason why contemporaneously we have a lot of legumes being grown, cycling in seasons.
Usually it's corn and soy.
So now let's transition into Aquarius, into another staple crop. This one's kind of obscure, but there's many different regions in the world that have this crop, and that is plantains, coconuts. Plantains and bananas are native to the island of Papua, just north of Australia. That's Papua New Guinea. Coconuts were also native to, I believe, the Melanesian Islands, potentially Indonesia, and were taken by the Polynesians all the way out to the farthest ends of the Pacific Ocean islands. And to this day, many tropical regions around the world grow coconuts. Plantains also were really popular in the Americas after being traded there from the East Indies.
So this category is kind of the odd one out, being that it's seemingly fruit-based, but it's kind of just this broader category of tropical plants that need to grow in kind of a coastal environment on islands. And so that's why something like coconuts that have a reproductive strategy of floating are pretty ubiquitous to islands all over the Pacific and spread quite readily, even without the assistance of human cultivation. And coconuts almost deserve to be a category all of their own because they're just ridiculously nutritious. Starchy, but also very fatty, and very meat-like in their characteristics, actually. And they can be eaten so many different ways. You know, the milk can be used and has great nutrition. The meat can be used a variety of ways, eaten fresh, dried, all kinds of things. And
they can also be very sweet and delicious and very nourishing.
Well, and the oil and fat can be eaten on its own or used to cook lots of other things. So having that high fat content makes it very useful in cooking techniques.
There are also some other fruits that, similarly, fruits tend to be quite sweet. In this region of Papua and also in southern India, jackfruit are from southern India.
I think so.
And they are a very starchy fruit that also made up something of a staple in southern India of its own.
Yeah.
Because similarly, they just had so many different nutrients.
And just a jackfruit is huge. Their yield
huge
is just,
fruits, yes.
These are kind of like the tank fruits. They're massive. They have high starch kind of content and really good yield. So when you do harvest these, jackfruit's actually used nowadays as potentially a meat substitute. It has sort of a pulled pork-like texture and can taste kind of barbecue, I guess.
Are those the ones that smell terrible?
No, those are durians.
Oh, durians? I thought they're similar. They seem to have a similar, I don't know. They're like kind of also large.
But there's lots of fruits that are kind of in that category.
They're in that ambiguous category that we just throw here in the tropical.
Tree, yeah.
Another variety is breadfruit, which is very aptly named because not only has it kind of the consistency, I think, of bread, where it's just full. It's a staple crop for the Papua people, alongside plantains and coconuts. And a lot of people, like, this is one of the most obscure contributors to the world in terms of food, as Papua has extremely unique, not just flora, but fauna as well, because it's part of the Australian continent. For the size of the island, it has some of the most hunter-gatherers still living on it today. Food like this, aplenty in the ecosystem, is part of the reason they could afford to just kind of gather.
Yeah. Well, island fruit is really unique because it doesn't have the same seasonality. It's affected by the monsoon seasons in some places, southern India in particular. But for the most part, these trees have various cycles that they're going through, and at any given time of the year, there's going to be some plant species that's going to be in fruit.
Yep.
And so it's pretty easy to, in a decent span of land, rotate between several different food sources at all times of year. It's not like you're planting one crop and then just harvesting all at once. things like coconuts, you're harvesting as they become ripe, and they have pretty steady production and are pretty hardy. Coconuts actually have evolved to be in kind of a semi-saline environment. They're lightly halophytic. They can't actually grow in pure salt water, but they have evolved to be sensitive to growing near enough to the coast to be able to drop their coconuts on the beach and in the water in order to reproduce. So that's why they don't actually grow inland. They don't move, which makes it kind of difficult to cultivate monocrop, but very unique strategy that they employ. And plantains actually do require preparation. Bananas you can pretty much live on. They're very nutritionally complete. You can eat pretty much just bananas if you really wanted to. It'd be a little weird, but you could do it. Whereas plantains need to be cooked and have some of the starch broken down. But there's lots of forms that plantains can take, and it's a pretty underutilized crop, I think. You see it a lot in Caribbean cuisines now.
And I think we decided to put this in Aquarius because Aquarius has such a free attitude.
Yeah.
Really a quite tropical attitude of, living life in the present or enjoying one's life. These aren't even really crops. It's just it's plants like these that they can just freely gather and move from place to place, gathering in good numbers and with good calories. Allows them to just live freely, really, and retain a hunter-gathering lifestyle without really having to deal with too much scarcity.
Right, because a lot of them can be eaten just raw. There's really no processing required whatsoever as long as they're in season. So it's hugely advantageous to a culture that wants to keep it low tech.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of the old Survival Man episodes where there's so many times he's trying to survive in like northern Canada or like even the Amazon and like deserts and stuff, all these hellish places where he's just like trying to get just one rabbit maybe, and that's like most of his, it's like the most delicious meal of all, just one little rabbit. And whenever he goes to a tropical island and tries to play out the whole stranded on an island situation, he almost always ends up being like lonely, sure, but like living large, eating well every day. He has fish, he has coconuts, you can have some crabs that are crawling by. Like there's so much. That's why people vacation there. And culturally it's huge.
Yeah.
Like it's a little easier to live. Carrying capacity is still a limit. Right. Hawaii to this day is very difficult to sustain because there's so many big cities there. They have to ship so much of their like main breads and things into Hawaii because it's not meant to go exponential. It's meant to stay at its carrying capacity and to just be gathered freely,
Hawaii is a really interesting just agricultural experiment in general because, the ancestral Polynesians that came there were actually brought with them very intentionally certain crops to get started. And all the things that you see there now were brought there and actually grown on purpose, which is really cool. And so the mix of things that, was there before the Banana Republic situation was actually pretty well in balance theoretically and had some really interesting synergies because you have a lot of meat culture from the chickens and pigs, like we talked about. You've got
Chinese
fish. You've got this tropical. You've got the absence of rice. And then you also have the taro root. So very interesting nutritional balance found there that was, not accidental. It was very man-made.
Tried and true on every... Like, imagine having an experiment every time you go to a new island. Look at how many different islands are in the Pacific and the Polynesian and Micronesia.
So taking all that experience and then applying sophisticated terraforming, it's a paradise for a reason, or at least.
And Hawaii especially because of its active volcanoes, has such rich soil. Now, it's not the kind of soil because of the biome that it can grow everything, right? Certainly not a lot of grasses, but it can grow so many kinds of fruits
attempts have been made to try to monocrop in Hawaii, particularly with dole pineapples and building those agricultural empires. But it very unsustainable. It really didn't work and kind of wrecked the whole thing.
I mean, the idea of a banana republic is what that is. It's a little dictatorship ran by basically a corporate CEO in order to get their cash crop to sell. There's a lot of coexistence with cash cropping from like colonial and neo-colonial influence, like tobacco, for instance, in like countries like Malawi in Africa is really big, despite the local population not having enough food to get by, even though they have some of the most productive agricultural lands in all of Africa.
Right.
When a place is not as highly developed, it's more like leisurely, because the tropical types of foods that we mentioned are so easy to get that cultures don't need to have such sophisticated social systems.
Right, yeah.
And
ones
so
that are isolated do tend to be a bit vulnerable.
Yes, and so like colonial and corporate powers can come into those places, set up shop on the coast, and hire those people out and start kind of exporting all these goods and whatever they want to plant in those lands to their countries, and the local people really don't have any say in it. They don't really have a connection to it. They don't really need it.
So that's very interesting, the association of these tropical crops with Aquarius, because of the really easygoing, malleable nature. And it's interesting that any of these island nation that are kind of close to land or close to one another, as you see in like Indonesia, become these incredible melting pots where you see the influence of several different staples, and tropical crops are really able to kind of glue them together and be this really interesting connective tissue in the cuisines, right? You see, like in the Caribbean and Indonesia, just these incredibly diverse, we talked about how rice has its nutritional limitations, but the tropical crops added to rice really make a great synergy, because you've got all the fattiness from coconut combined with rice. You can kind of get away with more stuff. And so you see that in like the Philippines and Thailand and places like that.
Where, like coconut-based curries and such.
So finally, bringing it back around the cycle to the meat side of things, here we have fish, a very
Pisces
source of meat.
Literally a fish, so this one is a given.
Yes.
It's very closely related to our last topic of tropical and island and marine cultures. Fishing cultures are very unique and yet very similar across cultures wherever you find them. You find some in Japan, then you have Britain, fish and chips, right? You have Polynesia that we were talking about, so
the New England coast, you have, the Atlantic fishing traditions.
Alaska.
This category, we are including other seafood as well. It's just, shellfish, crustaceans,
just
all
all
of those.
seafood.
All seafood, so it's a pretty huge category, and I realize it's a little bit unfair perhaps to the other categories, but historically, ancestrally, fish were just so invaluable in the evolution of humans and our early civilization, and we depended really heavily on them, both for a staple crop, a source of food, and also with curing them to create fish sauces, oils, and pastes. We use fish oil for all sorts of other things, for flavoring and for nutritional supplement and for cooking.
Yes. Even many vegetarian cultures are pescatarian, so they accept fish because fish is something so fundamental that it almost to people doesn't count as hunting or as animal product. It's so ubiquitous or so common. Now, another note about civilization or the Neolithic relation to fish. There was a wave of cultures even before agriculture was really being experimented with, and before shepherdry or animal husbandry was being experimented with. There was a spreading of sophisticated fishing tools. It's actually a very underappreciated moment in history, because fishing was like, of course, humans had fished for a long time, but really you can kind of specialize in fishing and be a fisherman. You need a lot of technologies. You need boats, that helps, fishing lines and thread and weaves, basic weaves, even just from sinews. It's really important. If you have bows, if you have spears, javelins, cutlery, basic cutlery, that helps. Actually, the oldest city or the oldest town or village or settlement we know of in Europe is on the Danube River in, I believe, Bulgaria, and on the border, near the border of Bulgaria and Serbia, and it was a fishing village. So this is an example where settlement was not because of agriculture, and it was not because of horticulture, it was because of fishing. And it was before either one of those came into the picture at all.
Yeah, fishing, we just really have no conclusion. We really have no idea. Fishing and even boats or rafts could be incredibly old. We have no real way to track that because, of course, boats are very, very difficult to preserve or find any evidence of.
Yeah, they're made of wood.
You know, we have these beautiful, elaborate, like, cave paintings of all of these terrestrial creatures and things, you know, and that's commonly pointed to as evidence of, like, oh, well, we got our start hunting big game and meat and, you know, all of those things. But it's like, yes, well, if we were fishing, we probably wouldn't be living in caves. Those things probably don't exist necessarily together. Geographically, they tend to be in sort of different places. So it doesn't really stand to reason that cave-dwelling people would also be coastal fishing people, usually. So, yeah, there's this whole wealth of evidence that we're probably just missing because of sort of the transient nature of the trade.
Even more evidence that that stuff could be missing is the fact that around the time these experiments would have been happening, sea level was far lower. And so there's all these lands throughout the world, like the Persian Gulf and Sunda land, which was a unified Indonesia, coasts of the Black Sea that were once Black Lake, that have since been submerged under the water with rising sea levels after the Ice Age meltwaters. And so if you were to have cave paintings in some places where people were fishing and maybe drawing boats, and maybe they had more evidence of that kind of life, it would be underwater at this point.
And alchemically, water represents change. So, yes, fishing culture is the most volatile to rising sea levels and changing conditions, catastrophic floods and things like that. So what's also very interesting is these cultures tend to be very oral tradition based, and they tend to have very elaborate stories. They tend to pass down and navigational techniques passed down orally. So what they might lack in physical artifacts, you know, it stands to reason that might be because even to this day they tend to be heavily storytelling and oral. Fish culture tends to be extremely cooperative, and especially passing down these techniques. There's, you know, competition between families or between tribes over the same kind of fishing grounds, but within a unit there is extreme cooperation and sharing.
Before fish farming, fish have to be found in the wild, and they tended to be around estuaries and other places with good amounts of nutrients, and estuaries would be the place right outside the river's mouth, essentially. So where some of the best silts and nutrients are coming from the river down, and the fish are feeding upon them, and plants are growing underwater. So these types of really active, good fishing zones would be fairly competitive. Many people would want to be getting at them, but everybody's going at it as a sort of public bowl, I guess. And you never see how many fish there are under there either. So there's not an idea of scarcity until things get really scarce. And it's only really been mostly in these decades of overfishing that we're seeing truly dying populations of fish.
Yeah, and also the sense of collectivism comes from the shared calamity that is just dealing with the ocean and how unpredictable and dangerous it is.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of needing to lean on each other, especially when you start going out further at sea and getting boats involved, right? There has to be a system of trust in place, you know, because emergencies do happen. Anybody who's watched the Deadliest Catch kind of shows, they're horrible, horrible work conditions, and in order to work a boat, you have to have a collective crew that is very much in sync with one another and has good communication and knows what to do in the case of a storm. Or
they're not going to eat each other if things get too hard.
Sponsoring one of these kind of boats would have been a collective endeavor, you know, with the rest of the village waiting to pick up other parts of the processing, other parts of supplementing with different foods as well, particularly rice.
It's kind of funny to see meat on this list and to consider the yield differences between, say, game meat and fish meat, but it's very evident. Fish yield is far greater. It's feasible that a game hunt can come away with one or a few kills in a particular evening, and you eat for that evening and you try to save as much, but it's probably just for a day, maybe a few days, and then you got to go hunt out again. But with fish, you really can go and you can get a really good load and bring it home and feed the village for days.
Right. There's a really big difference between the different types of fish and their potential preservation methods. We were talking the other day about teeny fish, right? Smelt and sardines and these kind of schooling fish that we have developed, canning techniques around and different drying and preserving, and they become kind of snack-like. So there's some of these fish that have such tiny bones you can kind of eat the entire thing, which is a little strange to us. I don't particularly prefer it, but it's a thing that you can do. I think on the whole, this is a category that you're either really into or really against. I think it's very, a lot of people just don't do fish at all. There's a lot of allergies.
I'm one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be kind of an acquired kind of thing.
I understand how I should like fish because it's so sustainable, relatively, if you do it right. And it is, like, biomagnification is another issue these days to worry about. Apparently we have to worry about radiation in the Pacific Ocean quite often. But in general, like, fish have a lot of good nutrients.
They're particularly fatty and efficient when compared to other, red meats. They have all of these amino acids and omega-3s, like things that are really good for us health-wise, and they're quite lean. They're not necessarily, fattening like a really marbled meat or like a pig or something like that. That's just got a lot of extra calories without providing, in the case of like bacon fat and things like that. So fish is extremely healthy. It's very difficult to overdo it, and lots of them have good preservation methods. So it's got a lot of advantages, although, it does put you kind of geographically in a bind. You do have to be close to some body of water. So like you said, locating a fishing village along a river would be advantageous. It's very active. You do have to actually do it, although there's certain things like shellfish catching where you're setting traps. If you have kind of more sophisticated trapping technology, sometimes it can be a lot more passive. Obviously, with modern boat fishing, net techniques, it's a little bit more passive, because you're casting the net and waiting. And so there's more ancient versions of that involve, like, casting nets over arranged rocks. It's high risk, and you have to kind of be doing it all the time. Most of those kind of fish, like sea fish, like, they're not necessarily lasting a long time. Of course, before refrigeration really made it a little bit limited. So that might be part of where the communal sentimentality came from, because it's like, well, you got to eat it while it's fresh.
And so fermentation, and they make fish sauce and things out of it. All kinds of acquired tastes.
Yeah. Well, fish sauce can go a really long way. We see it in the case of garum, which was a staple in Rome. It was such a versatile ingredient and really propelled that civilization forward. However, I don't know what garum might be like. I can't imagine it's that unlike an Asian fish sauce, but maybe, I don't know.
Maybe they added lots of olive oil to it. It's kind of interesting when you're talking about, having to kind of commit full time as a fisherman to it. It's very similar to hunting culture and it's also gendered. It's very gendered similarly. The men go out fishing and the women stay home and they cook. So it's this idea of, especially when it comes to like getting on the boat and going fishing, going out to the place that has the good stuff and being gone for a while, maybe even a few days in some cases. It's something like going out on the hunt and then coming back with the goods, but the yield's higher. The fact that some of the first villages were founded by fishermen and long before agriculture and other things started becoming part of the equation, it really shows a blend of hunter-gathering with a settled semi-sedentary lifestyle, because you could have your village on a river or on a coast, and then you could take your boat and get on a boat with a bunch of people, and you could go to wherever the best fishing points are, and then you come back. And part of the reason that's a little more sedentary is because boats and water is a much faster highway than land ever is, until you have actual roads and wheels and, trains eventually, and cars eventually. Until then, you don't really have a fast highway. So waterways are the highway. And being able to go very far very quickly allows you to go out on that hunt and come back to the same place. You don't have to settle a new town or like bring your town with you.
Right, you need a nomadic lifestyle with portable housing.
Yeah, you don't need to be nomadic in order to do fishing. You can kind of be semi-nomadic in a way. You just go out to fish and they come home. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like fishing culture is more of an evolution of hunter culture, and then like agriculture is kind of a extension of gathering culture. Mm-hmm. And they both went in kind of a different direction of specialization. Then you have shepherd in the middle, where a shepherd is taking the herd that you would regularly hunt and protecting it in some cases, culling the population in other cases. So you have those three modes that are very unique.
We're heavily implying that all diets should be heavily inclusive in all of those things, and so we're trying to examine these staple crops kind of as the caloric basis, and ideally in studying all of these things, the hope and the intention of presenting this video and these ideas is to try to synthesize kind of a varied, ideal, and inclusive of all of these 12 categories type of diet that will see the benefits of including all of these things in appropriate amounts and being grown more. And being grown in their appropriate regions and in a sustainable way, and engaging in permaculture as much as possible. So that's why the things like squashes and just vegetables as a category, as far as like
and also
greens
and
berries,
other fruits and nuts,
all of those tend
just
to
herbs.
be those are more on the like gathering foraging side of things.
Yes.
And it's I think it's meant to be assumed that all of those things are held in common.
It's a whole nother video.
Yeah. As far as like what the majority of land usage is going to be dedicated to, these are the categories that have been identified as A, providing the majority of the calories, and B, taking up the majority of the land.
I for instance, if you remember, I was arguing that orchard as a category could have been an entire group in here that would have included nuts and many fruits that they do take up land. That's especially true. These days, like even when you're thinking vineyards and grapes as well, like so much of that Mediterranean cultural climate is very based on orchards, and a lot of even the Neolithic expansion, nuts and figs and all these other kinds of things were extremely important to supplementary diets. Having an entire culture based on just orchard food probably wouldn't work. Right. They would have to have some sort of staple.
Yeah, those things are more nutritional, they're supplemental. But as far as like what fills the bellies, that's kind of what these categories are looking at. And also just as far as the usefulness as a mnemonic device, looking at the relationship between the values of these, zodiacal tribes and what staples are cultivated and what demands those place on an environment and what, taboos they might introduce, what conflicts, and also what synergies. Like all of those things were patterns I wanted to really examine within a kind of finite system such as this. This isn't meant to be final, but I did want it to be finite as in there was kind of a closed loop that could be examined.